Hi, I'm Darren Decker. I've been doing gas chromatography for 22 years, and I've spoken with virtually hundreds of gas chromatographers on how to improve their methods and use Agilent J&W GC columns to take the chromatography to the next level.
I'm Herb Brooks. I've been a service engineer at Agilent for 19 years, and I talk with customers every day about how to get the most out of their instruments by troubleshooting and repairing common and not so common problems.
I'm sure you'll agree with me, Herb, that the key to good chromatography is in the columns and supplies that are used in the instrument.
They definitely are important, for sure. But I'd have to emphasize the setup and maintenance of the instrument as being most important.
Really? Well, we both know it takes all those things working together to get the best performance. What I find is often the case is that a chromatographer might think one thing is the issue when it's often a completely different issue that might be causing the poor result.
It's complicated.
It is complicated. So that's why we've decided to get together and go through some basic troubleshooting, both from the chromatography side and from the instrument maintenance side. The two are often very closely related. I'd like to break it down into 5 basic areas where the problem can arise: inlet, flow, column, detector, and electronics. And perhaps there is a 6th, sample prep. In other words, you're having problems not because of the instrument or the chromatography, but because somebody didn't prepare the sample correctly. And the instrument is actually telling you the truth. Something is wrong, but in this case, it isn't the instrument or the chromatography, it's the sample. But we're not going to go into sample prep today. If we look at the 5 basic areas, they really follow the sample path or the path of the chromatography. We go from the gas coming in the back, going through our injector and our inlet, through the column, over to our detector, and then ending up at our data system. If we think of those terms, help keep things related to what areas are coming in contact with the sample and in what order. In both of our experience, a very high number of problems associated with GC are going to be inlet related. They're just more things that don't go through a GC than do. We call this stuff non-volatile contamination. And it ends up in the injector and on the head of the column. Now, knowing what can and cannot cause the problem can help too. You don't want to be fixing the inlet if your problem has nothing to do with the inlet. At that point, you can only make things worse since there wasn't a problem with the inlet. Same thing with the column or other parts. If they can't be the problem, then you're only going to make things worse if you start fixing them. So by knowing what can cause the problem, you can focus on those things that really can be effective in fixing the problem. Look at this chromatogram that a customer shared with me recently. This is supposed to be a blank run. Extra peaks are appearing mysteriously on the chromatogram, throwing the entire analysis into question. Well, what causes them? How can we make them disappear? We call these ghost peaks, and there are a number of common causes. Incidentally, you can eliminate the column as the problem because columns don't produce peaks. People do. Columns just don't decide, hey, I think I'll make benzene today, and voila, there's benzene. Look what I made. Peaks have to come from somewhere and get into the column. Columns just chromatograph peaks that are introduced into them. Here's what your basic chromatogram of air should look like. Now, here's the injection that our customer ran. As you can see, there's ghost peaks in his chromatogram. If you're getting ghost peaks but you didn't inject anything, it's not the column, it's something more than likely prior to the column introducing those peaks. Make sense? One of the first things you should consider if you're getting ghost peaks is the quality of your sample. Contaminants may be getting introduced with the sample. They're in the sample or they're in the solvent used with the sample. The solution? Get it out of the sample or the solvent. SPE, liquid-liquid extraction, etc. These are used to clean your sample, but if it wasn't there before and now you see it, perhaps the contaminant's in the glassware, the sample handling devices, or perhaps the solvent itself. Try different vials, different glassware, pipettes, or a different solvent until you find the contaminant. We had an incident at a customer site where a plastic bag that the vial inserts were shipped in was contaminating the vial inserts. After rinsing or baking out the inserts, we removed the contaminants. A different supplier of inserts with different packaging was needed to remove the problem permanently. So be sure to check your sample handling steps for potential contamination sources. Look at the way your samples are being handled, transferred, and stored. But didn't I say I wasn't going to talk about sample prep?
Yeah, you did.
Okay, well, enough of that. Here's an example of a chromatogram which could result from installing the column with the contamination on your hands, in this case, French fries. They contaminated the inlet end of the column above the ferrule, and it got into the flow stream, collected on the column while it was at a low temperature, and then chromatographed off. Simply wiping the ends of the column with a lab wipe and some suitable solvent like methanol or acetone after handling the column will usually avoid this kind of problem.
We should mention the gas cylinder too. I've noticed that many customers see this kind of issue right after they've changed the gas cylinder. You should always use high purity gases. You should always purge the gases when you replace the cylinder. Another good practice is to use a 3-stage cartridge filter which removes moisture, hydrocarbons, and oxygen. The filter also prevents the contaminants from entering into the system while you've got the gas lines disconnected.
Okay, so you've checked your sample and your solvent and your gas line, and if you're still getting ghost peaks, the first place I'd recommend someone to look at is the inlet. There may be contamination in the inlet itself. I told the customer in the example I showed you earlier, first try running the injector hotter and see if the problem increases, which would probably indicate the injector or septa area, something like that, is contaminated. At this point, you're in a place where you have contamination and you want to clean your inlet.
I'll take you through the basic process of GC inlet maintenance: cleaning the inlet, changing the liner, and replacing the septa and gold seal. These are key activities that every GC operator should be able to perform. Ideally, you'll do inlet maintenance according to a regular schedule and avoid instrument downtime and sample rework. Deciding on a schedule depends on a few factors. These include how many samples you run, the type of samples you run, and how critical are the results. A QA lab that runs hundreds of relatively dirty samples a day might have a schedule for replacing the septum and liner daily, the gold sealed weekly, and the split vent trap every 3 months. In the other extreme, a lab running only a few clean samples a day might replace the septum weekly and the liner once a month. Whatever your schedule is, the consumables need to be replaced before they quit protecting your GC. Replace the septum before it has an air leak and damages your column. Replace the liner and gold seal before dirt builds up and that causes contamination peaks. Replace the split vent trap before dirt gets into the split vent valve or causes a shift in retention time or area counts. The starting point for any of the inlet maintenance procedure is to create a method that protects your GC column. Essentially, you want to cool the inlet and the oven and depressurize the inlet. First, let's create a copy of an analytical method for this instrument and change the name to include IM for inlet maintenance. Under the instrument parameters, let's set the oven temperature to about 40 degrees. And apply. And let's set the inlet temperature to off and the pressure to 0. If we were going to work on the column or the detector, we'd change the detector settings also. Now, we'll save the method. Next time we do inlet maintenance, we can simply load this method and wait until the GC comes ready. Now that the inlet has cooled and depressurized, I'll show you how to replace the inlet septum, liner, and O-ring. Some companies replace these on a daily or weekly basis depending on the number of samples they run. You'll need the wrench that came with your GC, tweezers, and the replacement consumables. During the procedure, avoid handling the clean consumables with your bare hands. Oil from your skin can cause extra peaks on your chromatogram. You'll need gloves to do this. Make sure they're lint-free and powder-free. Okay, here we go. Loosen the septa retainer nut. Use your tweezers to remove the septum from the retainer nut. Remember now, do not gouge or scratch the interior of the septum head. Firmly place the new septum into the fitting. Install the septum retainer nut finger tight. Tighten the septum nut until the C-ring is about 1 millimeter above the nut. Over-tightening the septum nut can cause contamination from the syringe, coring of the septum, and depositing pieces into the inlet. Next, we'll replace the liner and the O-ring. Slide your locking tab forward. Lift the septum retaining assembly straight up and away from the inlet to avoid chipping or breaking the liner. Loosen your O-ring from the seal of the surface with your tweezers. Grasp the liner with tweezers and pull it out. Inspect the surface of the gold seal for graphite or rubber septum contamination. If required, replace the gold seal. Clean the inlet if there's visible or suspected contamination. Clean the O-ring residue from the seal surface. Slide a new O-ring onto the replacement liner. Return the liner into the inlet, pushing it all the way until the liner contacts the gold seal. Line up the tab on the bottom of the septum assembly with the slots on the insert assembly and push down to connect. Slide the locking tab to the back. Turn on the inlet. Allow the inlet and the column to purge with carrier gas for 15 minutes before heating the inlet or the column. Restore the analytical method. If you keep track of this maintenance, record it in a logbook or Lab Advisor software. Some of our GCs include counters that you can reset. For most applications with clean volatile samples, we suggest that you replace the gold seal monthly. Companies that are analyzing dirty samples or have high sample throughput may need to replace this part more often. Many companies schedule the replacement of the gold seal at the same time they replace the liner. One approach would be to replace the gold seal during every fourth liner change. Before you start replacing the gold seal, load your maintenance method to cool the inlet and oven and depressurize the inlet. For parts, you'll need the seal replacement kit, the one with the stainless steel washer. For tools, you'll need 1 1/4 inch and 1 1/2 inch open-end wrench. During the procedure, avoid handling the seals with your bare hands. Remember, oil from your skin can cause extra peaks on your chromatogram. The gold seal is at the bottom of the inlet where the column is connected. To get to the gold seal, we must first remove the liner and then the column. First, remove the liner. Then, using the 1/4 inch open-end wrench, remove the column from the inlet. Cap the opened end to prevent air or contamination from entering the column. Also, remove the insulation cup around the base of the inlet. Loosen and remove the reducing nut. Remove the washer and the seal inside the reducing nut. Put a new washer in the reducing nut and place the gold seal on top of it with the flat surface facing up. Replace the reducing nut and tighten securely with a wrench. Your gold seal has now been replaced. Install the insulation cup and the column. Then, replace the inlet liner. From there, turn on the inlet. Allow the inlet and the column to purge with carrier gas for 15 minutes before heating the inlet or the column. Restore the analytical method. If you keep track of this maintenance, record it in your logbook or Lab Advisor software. Some of our GCs include counters that you also can reset.
A good way to determine if your contamination is in the inlet or gas lines is to do a condensation test too.
Yes, to do a condensation test, we simply run a blank run after a long period of non-use, such as overnight or over the weekend. The GC should be at the starting temperature during this time. This allows for any of the contamination that's in the lines or in the inlet to collect on the head of the column. We start the condensation test simply by starting the GC without injecting. If we see ghost peaks, we need to do a second run with the temperature ramp. If the contamination peaks of the first run are larger than the contamination peaks of the second run, the problem is in the inlet or the gas lines.
This is because the longer the oven is at the low temperature, the more the contamination collects on the column. If you don't see the ghost peaks, chances are you have another type of contamination or carryover, such as in the syringe or in the sample or something like that. If you do have contamination in the line, how did it get there? This indicates backflash or injection overload. If you have this problem and you don't address it, it's just going to get worse every time you make an injection. You'll be depositing more and more stuff into those lines, parts, fittings, and it'll get worse over time.
I was just with a customer last week who had two mass specs that were having ghost peak issues. The root cause of the ghost peaks was injection volume, which caused backflash. We changed the split vent trap and the ghost peaks disappeared. This solved the issue for a while, but sooner or later, the customer would see random ghost peaks again if they don't address their backflash problem.
Let's discuss exactly what backflash is. This happens when the vapor volume exceeds the liner volume. And where does the sample go? Everywhere. The problem is that the vapor can condense on the cooler part in the top of the injector lines, or wherever, because it isn't as hot there. That condensed sample will still have a headspace or a vapor which can be swept forward onto the column. And the image we're looking at here is the temperature profile of a typical injector versus the oven temperature. As long as the column is hot enough, that vapor will still go and not cause any problems. But if the column is cool, it's possible for that vapor to now collect and trap on the front of the column. Now, as long as that's a low concentration, you probably won't see anything. But as you fortify this condensed sample by making more injections, you can get it to a high enough concentration that you'll actually see bonus peaks in every run. This carryover is in the injector. The only way to get rid of it is to clean the injector or to set up a bunch of clean solvent blanks with a high volume to flush it out. But if you don't change your conditions, the temperature, the injection volume, the solvent type, it's just going to happen again.
Here's what we're talking about, the weldment assembly. The weldment assembly can be cleaned or replaced, especially if you're running pesticides or semivolatiles. You may find some residual material coats the weldment. You want to clean it to minimize the inlet activity. You don't have to remove the inlet to clean it. I just removed it for this example. First, you would have to prepare the inlet by removing the column from the bottom, the inlet consumables from the top, and disconnect the split line over here. Then you would take a long Q-tip soaked in solvent. If you're using hexane to clean the syringe, hexane should work. Then you would run a long Q-tip along the sides of the weldment to remove any contaminants.
So if you're getting sample backflash, there are steps you can take to prevent it. You can reduce the injection volume, lower the inlet temperature, change solvents, and/or use a larger volume liner. You can also try pressure pulsing the injection if you have that capability. Pressure pulsing is done by setting the injection mode to one of the pulsed modes, either pulsed splitless or pulsed split. A window will open up to ask you what pressure you would like to do. We simply go into the inlet section, and we notice there's 4 modes: split, splitless, pulse split, or pulse splitless. We set it to one of the splitless pulsed modes, and now we have to determine how high of a pulse do you want to go. I typically like to use 2 times the current pressure, or as much as 3 times. Making sure, of course, that I don't use a higher pressure than what I have going to the GC, or higher than my inlet is rated. The standard EPC, or electronic pneumatic control module, is rated to 100 psi. But we do have a high pressure EPC that goes to 150 psi. The time for the pulse is mostly determined by how long the sample is being transferred to the column. For a split injection, typically 3 to 6 seconds is plenty of time for the pulse. But for splitless injection, you may want to pulse up to 30 to 45 seconds. I generally like to pulse it for just a few seconds less than my purge activation time, but I have met analysts that prefer to pulse a few seconds longer than their purge activation time. Try both and see what works better for you. It may take a little trial and error to dial it in, but these are good starting points. Pulsing should sharpen the sample band onto the column and could enhance sensitivity by putting more of it on the column. Remember, what we are ultimately trying to do is keep the sample from overloading the inlet, prevent that backflash from occurring. The size of the vapor cloud produced upon injection is dependent on 4 things: the inlet temperature, the carrier gas head pressure, the physical properties of the solvent being used, and the volume of injected sample. You can download our free vapor volume calculator to help you with this. When it comes to the liner selection, there's actually quite a lot to consider: deactivation, glass wool, how much glass wool is used, the volume of the liner, the tapers, top or bottom, thermal mass considerations, and how that affects volume.
That sounds like a lot to cover. Can we go back to our ghost peak issue now?
Yeah, sorry. Liner selection is a huge topic for another discussion. Let's get back to ghost peaks.
The other issue to consider is that you might be getting ghost peaks due to septum bleed. It's important to use high-quality septum appropriate for the inlet temperature. When the septum gets older, it can begin to crack and core or just degrade due to thermal stress, which can cause contaminants to bleed into your inlet onto your column. I can check for that by replacing my septum. I already took you through a pretty thorough GC inlet maintenance process, and that included replacing the septum. Sometimes all you need to do is replace the septum to correct your problem.
In fact, some people have attributed these septa peaks to the column, since they typically see siloxanes if they have a mass spec. The key is that they are peaks. Remember, columns can't chromatograph themselves. They won't give peaks. If the column is bleeding, the background signal goes up because there isn't a point source for the bleed. The entire column bleeds. If you get a peak, something entered the chromatographic process and gave a peak. And that's how we know it's something outside of the column, and in this case, the septa. It bleeds and it collects on the front of the column when the column's cool, and then the peaks chromatograph when we go through a temperature program.
Have we gotten all our ghost peak problems?
Not yet. Another thing we should consider is whether you might be getting carryover from previous injections or semi-volatile contamination. If the ghost peaks widths tend to be broader than the normal sample peaks right around them in the same part of the chromatogram, this is usually sample carryover. You'll see 2 examples on the screen what carryover looks like. This carryover indicates that not everything is eluting from the column before it cools down for the next analysis. Sometimes you won't even see the problem ghost peaks until much later runs, 6 or 7 runs into it, maybe more. These artifacts, the ghost peaks from sample 1, maybe showing up in sample 20. And of course, that means there's something for sample 21, sample 22, and so on and so on. If this is your issue, then you should extend your bakeout at the end of each analysis. You could also do a periodic bakeout for higher boiling semi-volatile contamination removal. But limit your bakeout to 1 to 2 hours and don't exceed the thermal limits of the column. So let's summarize the key points for Ghost Peaks. Start with a high purity solvent and take care to avoid contamination in sample prep.
Check your gas lines and purge them, especially if you've changed the filter. Perform GC inlet maintenance.
Minimize backflash by looking at your liner volume, injection volume, solvent choice, inlet temperature all play a role in the vapor volume created in the injector. Pressure pulsing the injection if you have EPC is another strategy to minimize backflash. You can download our vapor volume calculator for free at www.agilent.com/chem/flowmeter to help you with these decisions.
One of the key takeaways here is you won't have to go through all these steps to solve your Ghost Peak issue. If you minimize backflash and you regularly maintain your GC, you'll be able to eliminate a likely cause from the outset. As we go further, you'll see basic inlet maintenance will eliminate most of your problems.